A key lawmaker launching a new effort to stop Obamacare before it's fully implemented. Texas Senator Ted Cruz urging conservatives to join a petition drive to defund the health care overhaul before the exchanges and subsidies kick in. He wants Americans to sign online a petition asking Congress to approve the September 30th continuing budget resolution only if it eliminates and blocks all funding for Obamacare. Senator Ted Cruz joins us now live from Washington. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Shannon, it's always great to be with you.
All right, I want to start with a quote I'm sure you're familiar with now from the president discussing those who want to block Obamacare, saying, "I'm not concerned about their opinions." Very few of them, by the way, are lawyers, much less constitutional lawyers. By our account from the Congressional Research Service, nearly 170 lawyers on the House side, 57 on the Senate side where you serve. The first time I met you was when you argued a case at the Supreme Court. You seem very familiar with the Constitution, so how do you respond?
Well, Shannon, that's right. The bulk of my professional career has been as a constitutional lawyer and litigator. And, you know, it is really sad to see this administration, this president, this Justice Department so consistently disregarding the Constitution, disregarding the law. And you look at Obamacare. Obamacare, this administration has decided to engage in selective enforcement. It's going to enforce it against some people, not against others, and the administration is not following the law as written. So, for example, just a few weeks ago, President Obama announced that he was going to unilaterally suspend the law for large companies with more than 50 employees. He was going to move the employer mandate until after the next election. Now, Shannon, you know, that has two important concessions in that. Number one, if Obamacare was working, if it were a good thing, President Obama would want it to kick in before the next election, not afterwards. The fact that he is scared about the American people realizing what a disaster Obamacare is and he wants to shift it to after the election, I think is very revealing. But number two, it raises the obvious question. If President Obama is willing to give a waiver to giant corporations, what about the rest of us? What about hardworking American families? And that's why I think Congress ought to stand together and defund Obamacare in its entirety, so not just big corporations getting a break, but every hardworking American family.
Well, Article 2 requires the president to make sure to uphold and faithfully execute the laws of this country. Are you saying he's not following the Constitution?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. The obligation, the president has a responsibility to take care to faithfully execute the laws of this land. And President Obama, sadly, over and over again, has disregarded the law, whether it was on immigration, when he decided to order his administration to disregard the law of the land, to disregard the immigration laws passed by Congress, or on Obamacare, when he finds parts of the law that are politically inconvenient. Rather than trying to change them, he simply says, we're not going to follow them. We decide, or I decide, in the case of the president, who the law applies to and who it doesn't. And that's not the way our Constitution works. That's not the way a system of government that limits government power to protect the citizenry is supposed to work.
Well, how is it limited? How is he limited then? What check is there on the executive branch if he continues to make these decisions, his administration as well? Right. We've seen Attorney General Eric Holder, who, despite the ruling we got from the Supreme Court just a few weeks ago on the Voting Rights Act, making his pronouncement that he intends still to go after a number of states, including Texas, regardless of that Supreme Court decision. So what is to limit the executive branch?
You're right. This is the most partisan Justice Department we've ever seen. On voter ID, the Attorney General has essentially said he's going to defy the Supreme Court and ignore the law. And the question you ask is critical. The most important check that Congress has on an overreaching executive is the power of the purse. And that's why the next 63 days matter so much. In 63 days, the continuing resolution expires. That's what funds government right now. I have publicly pledged, along with Senator Mike Lee, Senator Marco Rubio, a number of others, that I will under no circumstances support a continuing resolution that funds even 1 penny of Obamacare. If we can get 41 Republicans in the Senate to stand together, or 218 Republicans in the House to stand together, we can successfully defund Obamacare on September 30th. And what it's going to take for that to happen is for the American people to rise up and demand it. That's why we've launched a national petition, DONTFUNDIT.com. DONTFUNDIT.com. The only way this will happen is if hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans tell their elected officials, tell Republicans, stand for principle, use the power of the purse, defend the Constitution, and don't fund Obamacare.
All right. The funding of Obamacare is one thing. The other issue, of course, is the funding of the U.S. government. You mentioned 63 days left. There has to be some type of consensus to come to a continuing resolution, which is basically the funding mechanism to keep the government going. There are a handful of you, and it is growing, who have pledged that you're not going to vote for any continuing resolution that has anything to do with one penny going towards Obamacare. Now, there are those who are calling this, quote, terror politics. And those aren't Democrats. That's a Republican, Peter King, over in the House, who said that. And they're cautioning against taking this tack. So what are you to do in compiling those numbers you mentioned, 218 in the House you need, when there are a number of Republicans vocally and publicly saying they're not going to go along with this?
You know, I think the American people are getting more and more sophisticated. They've learned there are a lot of Republican politicians that like to say they're opposed to Obamacare. They like to cast empty symbolic votes. I think the House has voted 39, 40, 41 times to repeal Obamacare, every one of which was a meaningless, empty vote because it had no teeth in it. And I think the American people realize we want more than a fig leaf. We actually want people who say they oppose Obamacare, in fact, to oppose Obamacare. Because I'll tell you, Shannon, if this thing goes into effect, the administration's plan is on January 1 to start the subsidies, start the exchanges, and their idea is get Americans hooked to the sugar, hooked to the subsidies, because in modern time there has been no major entitlement that's gone into force that's ever been unwound. And so this is our last and best chance to defund it. The wheels are coming off. Its lead Senate author, Democrat Max Baucus, called it a train wreck. But here's the simple truth of the matter. If we're going to win this fight to defund Obamacare, it's not going to be one. This is not a fight I can win. It's not a fight Mike Lee can win, Marco Rubio can win. No politician in Washington will win this fight. The only way we will win this fight is if the American people, if the grassroots rise up in incredible numbers, if we go to DONTFUNDIT.com, we sign a national petition, and every one of us picks up the phone, calls our elected officials, and says, talk is cheap, stand up, use the constitutional power of the purse, and defund Obamacare. Now, if we stand together, we can win this fight, but if we surrender, as Republicans are so good at, it's guaranteed we will not win this fight.
All right, you gave a rousing speech at the Western Conservative Summit a few days ago. Press accounts are that there were several standing ovations. After all was said and done, they had a straw poll there because it's 2013, and why not start straw polling 2016? You won with 45% of the vote in that straw poll. Are you running for president?
You know, Shannon, my focus is entirely on the Senate, and I'll tell you that very kind outcome in the straw poll, I think, was reflective of what grassroots conservatives are feeling across the country, which is a frustration with Washington politicians. What I talked about in Denver was the need for grassroots conservatives to rise up and take back our country, not to count on any politician, including me, but to count on mobilizing the American people. I think we've got a totally different paradigm, where when the grassroots get engaged, when we demand of our elected officials they do the right thing, where we make it more risky to do the wrong thing than it is to do the right thing, that's how we've won fights in the past, whether it's on drones or guns, and that's how we're going to win this fight on defunding Obamacare. My focus is very much, I know it's easy to focus on the politics, but rather than focus on the politics, I am working very hard to focus on the substance of defending liberty, returning to free market principles, and restoring our constitutional protections. And the only way that happens is if grassroots conservatives get engaged, go to DONTFUNDIT.com, call their elected representatives, and demand that every one of us be held accountable, me as well, all of us, to stand for principle and help turn our economy around so people can get back to work towards achieving the American dream.
All right, Senator, I'll give you a couple more months before I ask again about the White House. Thank you, Senator Ted Cruz, for your time. We're back with more right after this.
Thank you, Shannon.